I lit the last candle just as the sun dipped below the neighbor's rooftop, casting a soft amber glow across my backyard table. Mismatched china plates, their edges chipped from years of use, sat patiently beneath linen napkins I hadn't unboxed since my wedding. A small pot of rosemary steamed near the corner, its scent curling up into the air like a whispered memory. The menu I chose tonight wasn't modern. It wasn't trendy. It was my mother's, handwritten in faded ink and grease-stained at the edges. And it had been buried in the back of my pantry for almost 4 decades. There was a strange flutter in my chest as I adjusted the forks. Hope, maybe. Or nerves. I hadn't hosted anyone in years, not like this. But tonight was different. Tonight I was reclaiming something. I wasn't sure who would actually show up, but I had cooked every dish with a kind of reverence. It felt like prayer, like proof that I still mattered. And then, just before the guests arrived, I heard it again. The memory of my granddaughter's voice from the last family dinner. No one eats like that anymore. She hadn't meant for me to hear. But I did. And that's when everything changed. I didn't even want to bring the chicken stew to the table that night. Something in me already knew it would go untouched. My hands paused over the ladle like I was waiting for a reason not to bother. But habit is louder than hope sometimes, so I filled the old ceramic bowl, the one with the hairline crack near the rim, and carried it to the dining room. They barely noticed. My son Michael was talking about a business merger. Susan scrolled through her phone, nodding absently. My granddaughter Ruby, tall now and dyed blonde, poked at the quinoa salad she'd brought from the deli down the road. I took my usual seat at the far end of the table, the spot where I used to place David's coffee cup. I smoothed my napkin into my lap and looked around at the faces I once fed every night. Faces that used to light up when they walked into my kitchen. Michael reached for the water pitcher without touching the stew. Ruby giggled suddenly and leaned toward her cousin. Grandma's recipes are sweet and all, she said in a mock whisper, but no one eats like that anymore. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't meant to be overheard. But it hit just the same. I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I just looked down at my hands, faint yellow under the nails from peeling turmeric root, wrists sore from stirring for hours, and swallowed something thick and invisible. Later, when everyone had gone and the dishwasher hummed quietly, I stood in the kitchen longer than I needed to. I stared at the half-full pot on the stove. 5 hours in the kitchen. Not even a spoonful touched. I packed up the stew in small containers and stacked them neatly in the fridge. I washed the plates, even the clean ones, just to keep my hands busy. When the counters were dry and the house was quiet, I turned off the light and stood for a long while in the dark. And when there was nothing left to scrub or wipe or fold, I went to the back room and pulled out the box I hadn't opened in more than a decade. It was tucked behind an old sewing basket, high on the shelf. A pale pink ribbon held it shut, though the knot had loosened with time. I carried it back to the kitchen like it might dissolve in my arms. Inside was my mother's recipe book. Not a book, really. A stitched collection of index cards and worn clippings, some handwritten, some torn from magazines, others full of grease spots and crooked notes. The edges curled like dried leaves. There were food stains on half the pages, gravy smudges, oil rings, flour dust still pressed into the folds. I hadn't needed it in years. Her recipes lived in me, buried in muscle memory and morning rituals. But I needed to see her handwriting that night. Needed to feel like someone still believed in the magic of a simmering pot and a well-folded napkin. I flipped through the pages slowly, running my fingers over her loops and slanted script. Notes in the margins. Use chicken thighs, not breasts, more flavor. David liked this with pickles. Add a splash of sherry if feeling low. For heartbreak, double the garlic. I smiled through a sudden ache. That was my mother, always adding love in places no one thought to look. And then I found it. Widow's Garden Supper, 1963. The ink was faded, smudged with something oily. 5 dishes were listed, simple, seasonal, comforting. One crossed out, replaced with another in tighter writing. At the bottom, nearly faded. Served under the grapevines. All hearts mended. I blinked, suddenly overwhelmed. I couldn't remember ever hearing about this supper. My mother wasn't one for elaboration, but I could picture it, her out back, white apron tied high, arms folded as women gathered with stories and empty plates. Maybe she needed it after Dad died. Maybe it was how she coped. And maybe I was ready to understand that now. I copied the ingredients for one dish onto a sticky note and opened the pantry. Carrots, onions, barley, bay leaf. I had everything I needed. I didn't light candles. I didn't set the table. I just cooked. The smell crept through the house like memory made physical. Rosemary and broth, garlic and thyme. It filled the corners of the living room, wove its way up the stairs. I hummed a song I didn't recognize until I realized it was something she used to sing. When it was ready, I ladled a portion into my favorite bowl, the small porcelain one with blue birds painted around the rim, and sat down alone. I ate slowly, thoughtfully, the way you read a letter from someone you miss. And when I finished, I felt full in a way that had nothing to do with food. I dozed off in the recliner, apron still on, the sticky note fluttering from the armrest to the floor like a petal. The next morning, I was sipping coffee in the same chair when a soft knock came at the door. Too early for mail. Too hesitant to be a delivery. When I opened it, Sheila from next door stood on the porch, still in her robe, clutching an empty coffee mug. "Sorry to bother you," she said, voice rough. I smelled something last night. Something I haven't smelled in years. And I couldn't stop thinking about it." She paused, looking down at her slippers. "Do you have any left?" I stared at her, unsure what to say. Sheila, who lost her husband 3 years ago and barely left the house except to water her garden. Sheila, who used to laugh with her whole chest but now barely smiled. I nodded. "Come in," I said. "I'll warm you a plate." She followed me into the kitchen slowly, like stepping into a memory. I handed her a bowl and watched her take the first bite. Her eyes welled up almost immediately. "This tastes like home," she whispered. She reached for a napkin and took another bite. "Do you cook like this often?" I shook my head. "Not anymore. Not until last night." She looked around the kitchen, her eyes scanning the cookbooks, the pots still drying on the rack. "You should," she said. She smiled. Just slightly. But it was enough to make something flicker inside me. A warmth I hadn't felt in years. Maybe it was time. Not to serve the whole world again. But maybe just one more plate. Maybe just once more. Maybe just enough. Sheila stayed longer than I expected. After the second helping, she leaned back in her chair, tears quietly drying on her cheeks, and started telling me about her husband. Not the parts one already knew, that he was a kind man, good with tools, gone too soon, but the quieter parts. The parts you only say when something in your belly has been satisfied. "He used to cook," she said. Never told anyone. But Sunday mornings when the kids were small, he'd sneak downstairs early and make pancakes. Only 3 of us knew. She looked down into her mug and then back up at me. "This stew tasted like that. Like something made in secret. Like love you didn't have to earn." We sat in silence a while longer. Not the uncomfortable kind, but the kind women slip into when they've both seen sorrow and don't need to dress it up. I offered her the recipe. She refused gently. It wouldn't taste the same. Before she left, she turned at the door and asked if I'd cook again next Friday. I said I would. And that's how it began. One woman, one memory, one full belly. That night, I opened my mother's book again. Not the recipe section this time, but the back, where she had kept notes from her own gatherings. Clipped napkins with names scribbled. Handwritten Seating charts. A wine stain shaped like a heart on a grocery list. She had her own supper club. I couldn't believe I hadn't known. On a folded paper tucked behind a loose recipe card was a short paragraph in her handwriting. "We cook so we don't forget. We eat together, so we remember. If someone cries at the table," the recipe worked. I closed the book and held it to my chest. I wasn't ready to cry, but I was close. By Wednesday, Sheila had already told someone. It was Diane, her older sister. I remembered her vaguely from years ago, another widow, quieter, always polite. She called and asked if she could come. She said she'd bring wine. I said yes. Then I sat on the back steps, nervous. 2 guests felt like a party. I hadn't hosted anything real since David's retirement. I worried whether the cushions were too faded, if the patio lights still worked, if my silverware matched. Then I laughed to myself. None of them cared. They were coming for something that had nothing to do with appearances. Friday came. I wore my navy sweater, the one David said made me look like someone who knew exactly what she was doing. I set the table with cloth napkins and mason jars for water. Sheila brought daisies in a vase. Diane arrived holding a pie she admitted was store-bought. I told her it didn't matter. We ate in the glow of string lights that still worked, surprisingly. I made chicken fricassee and honey-glazed carrots. It wasn't fancy, but it was enough. Diane didn't cry until the pie. She said, "This tastes like the last meal we had before the doctor said the word stage 4. No one spoke for a moment. Then Sheila reached across the table and held her sister's hand. I understood, in that moment, what the food was really doing. It wasn't filling bellies. It was making space to remember, space to grieve, space to say, I miss them, without needing a tissue box or a therapist's nod. The following Monday, I received a handwritten thank you note in the mail. I hadn't seen one of those in years. Dear Margaret, it said, I didn't know how much I needed to be fed until you fed me. I think your mother would be proud. I read it 3 times. And then I picked the next recipe. That week, I baked bread for the first time in months, simple sourdough, just like my mother taught me, with the slashes on top shaped like leaves. While it cooled, I polished the silver again. Not because it needed to shine, but because it made me feel like I mattered. Sheila called again. There's a woman from my church. Her name's Marlene. She lost her daughter a year ago and hasn't really come back to herself since. I didn't promise her anything, but I think she'd like it. My heart pounded a little. 3 was more than a pair. 3 made it feel like something real was happening. I wasn't just cooking. I was hosting, holding, healing. Tell her she's welcome, I said. Just tell her to come hungry. That Friday, I brought out my grandmother's serving platter, the heavy porcelain one with a faded rose at the center. I hadn't used it since David's 70th. It had always been reserved for special occasions. This, I decided, counted. Marlene arrived with a quiet, cautious smile and a loaf of banana bread wrapped in foil. She didn't say much at first. Just sat, listened, and ate. But somewhere between the roasted squash and the apple crisp, her voice began to come alive. She spoke of her daughter's laugh, of how she used to help in the kitchen, standing on a stool with flour in her curls. She spoke of how the silence in her house had become unbearable. Eating with other people again, she said, wiping her eyes, it feels like breathing differently, like something is unclogging. The other women nodded. That night, after everyone left, I sat in the quiet and wrote their names on a note card, just like my mother had done. And below it I wrote, next Friday for chairs. 1 table. Something healing. Marlene came back the next week. She arrived 10 minutes early and asked if I needed help setting the table. She wore a lavender sweater and a small gold pin shaped like a leaf. I told her yes, and handed her a stack of linen napkins. We folded them together at the counter while the bread cooled. I used to do this every week, she said, smoothing a crease with her thumb. Dinner parties. Back when Neil was alive. I'd light candles and play Nina Simone on the record player. I smiled. What stopped you? She looked at me and said, without bitterness, no one came anymore. That night, the table felt warmer. The conversation flowed, without trying. I made a lamb stew and served it with warm flatbread and mint yogurt. Marlene brought her record player. Sheila lit a dozen tiny candles in mason jars and set them on the steps. Diane arrived with her hair curled and a story about her grandson getting caught sneaking cookies at school. Something had shifted. No longer were we gathering for grief alone. There was laughter now. We still cried sometimes. There was still the silence when someone's voice cracked mid-sentence. But now, it came with stories that made us smile afterward. It felt like memory was no longer a weight we carried. It was something we passed around the table. The stew was a success. Everyone had seconds. And when the bread ran out, Diane took off her shoes, padded into my kitchen, and made scrambled eggs for us all with a little cheese and herbs. "This is how we stretch a meal," she said. My mother taught me. No one left until midnight. I couldn't stop smiling. Not in the look how happy I am way, but something quieter. Something earned. The next morning, I found a small jar of homemade jam on my porch with a note. "Thank you for feeding my soul. M." And I realized I wasn't just hosting dinners. I was building something. Later that week, Lila showed up. She was the new girl at the corner house, a single mom I'd only seen from afar, always rushing, always tired. I found her on my front steps Thursday morning, cheeks red, her little boy clinging to her leg. "I'm sorry to just come like this," she said, voice shaking. "But Miss Sheila said you host dinners. That they're kind." I nodded and invited her in. The boy stayed outside, poking a stick into the flower bed. She didn't say much, just sat at the counter while I made tea. She stared at the pot of soup on the stove and said, "That smells like the stuff my grandma made when I had the flu." I smiled. "Chicken and lemon. Greek style. Wanna try?" She nodded. I poured a small bowl and handed it to her with a slice of crusty bread. She dipped it quietly, bit, then burst into tears. "I haven't tasted anything that reminded me of being safe in years," she said. I placed my hand over hers and said nothing. Friday night came, and Lila returned, this time with her son, who sat in the corner coloring while we ate. We made space for him and for her. By now we were 7 at the table. 7 women. 7 different lives. Each with their own chapter of grief, of survival, of silent resilience. And we kept adding more chairs. Each week, someone brought someone new. One had just retired. One had just divorced. One had lost a sister to cancer and couldn't stop folding her napkin. Another brought her teenage granddaughter, who barely spoke until dessert. What amazed me most wasn't just the women who came. It was the way they showed up. With dishes in hand. With open hearts. With no expectations except the hope of feeling something they hadn't felt in a long time. Welcome. We shared everything. Recipes. Memories. Fears. Tips on stretching a grocery budget. Stories about love that was lost or never fully returned. Someone brought a photo album one night. Another read a poem. It wasn't always heavy. Sometimes we laughed so hard I had to open the window to let the air settle. But other nights, it was quiet, reverent. One night, Marlene whispered, "Do you ever think we're doing church without realizing it?" And I thought, yes. Except here, there was no judgment. No script. No shame. Only bread. And soup. And candles. And the kind of conversations that stitched us back together. That Sunday, I pulled out my mother's recipe book again. I hadn't noticed it before, but tucked inside the back cover was a folded piece of parchment. In faint pencil, she had written, "Host the meal. Don't wait for permission. Women who feed each other survive longer." I read that line 5 times. Then I copied it, word for word, onto a recipe card of my own. It had been 5 weeks since I served that first quiet bowl of stew, and somehow, without planning, my Fridays had become sacred again. There was no formal list. No RSVP. Just word of mouth, and a knowing glance from one woman to another during an afternoon walk or a grocery store run. I never turned anyone away. I didn't have a sign. Didn't need one. By the 6th week, we needed more chairs. Marlene brought 2 folding ones from her garage. Sheila offered up her patio bench. I started keeping an extra pot warm, just in case someone showed up late. The menu changed each week. Sometimes it was a roast with vegetables. Sometimes baked ziti. Once, I tried my hand at a Moroccan tagine and nearly burned it, but no one cared. They said the house smelled like adventure. What stayed the same was the silence at the beginning, the kind that fell just after everyone settled in before the first bite. They were all holding their breath together. And then came the release. Cutlery clinking, soup being poured, someone softly asking, "How was your week?" One Friday, Nora arrived early. She was a quiet woman, one of the few who hadn't spoken much. She always helped with dishes, always stayed until the end, but never shared more than polite words. She came carrying a covered dish and something else in her hands, a photo album. "I thought," she said, "I might show you something tonight." We waited until dinner was over. Then she placed the album in the middle of the table and opened it to a black and white photo of a girl sitting on a stone wall. "That's me," she said. "When I was 12. That day was the last time my mother ever made pot roast." The table fell still. "She died the next week," Nora said.
Car accident.
"After that, I couldn't eat pot roast again. Not for 50 years. She looked at the dish she'd brought. "I made it last night. I wanted to see if I still could." We all took a small serving. No one said a word as they ate. It was tender, rich, simple. The kind of meal built from memory, not instruction. Nora didn't cry, but she smiled, and it changed something in her face. Made it brighter, stronger. And just like that, she began to talk. She told us about her father, about how he never remarried and raised her the best he could. About the neighborhood she grew up in, the girl she kissed behind the church at 16, the job she had for 30 years that no one at the table had ever heard of. The table listened like it was all brand new. Later that night, while we were drying dishes together, Nora said, "I thought I'd forgotten how to be part of something." I told her, "You didn't forget. You were just waiting for the invitation." That weekend, I bought more silverware at a thrift store downtown. None of it matched. I liked it that way. Each fork and spoon had lived a different life. That felt fitting. When I got home, I found a small brown envelope tucked in my mailbox. No name, just a note inside. "Thank you for letting us be fed." It didn't say who it was from, but the handwriting looked familiar. I set it in the recipe book, just behind the page for tomato basil soup. The next Friday, we had 9 people. Someone's cousin from out of town. A former nurse named Joy, who hadn't cooked since her husband died. A retired teacher who brought cinnamon buns and a recipe written on the back of an old lesson plan. Lila helped me in the kitchen that night. Her son colored pictures in the living room while we worked. "He asked me if this was our new family," she said, wiping her hands on a towel. "What did you say?" I told him it might be. I didn't answer right away. I just handed her a jar of pickled onions and watched her smile. Near the end of dinner, Joy raised her glass, ginger ale, not wine, and said, "This is the first time I've looked forward to something in over a year." We all lifted our glasses, whatever we had in them, to showing up hungry, Diane said, which made everyone laugh. The toasts kept coming. To second helpings. To forgotten recipes. To old chairs that still hold us. To the women who still make space. And then Lila, in her quiet voice, added, "To being welcome, without needing to earn it." That one got me. I held onto the stem of my glass a little tighter. After everyone left, I walked through the kitchen slowly. The candle wax had pooled onto the saucers. The sink was full again. But it didn't feel like work. It felt like proof that something real had happened here. Before I went to bed, I wrote down the name of every woman who came that night. I put a small check next to each one. And in the corner of the page, I added a simple note. 10 chairs. Still not enough. The following week brought something new. It started with a phone call from Susan. She rarely called, for no reason. Usually, it was to coordinate holidays or ask about a recipe she wasn't actually going to make. So when I saw her name flash across the screen on a Tuesday morning, I hesitated before answering. "Hi, Mom," she said. I ran into Sheila at the post office. I waited. "She mentioned your Friday dinners." I held the phone tighter. "She said it's a thing now, like a club." I said nothing, not yet. "She said it's really helping people. That you've been hosting all these women every week." Her tone wasn't sharp, but it wasn't gentle either. "Why didn't you tell me?" she asked. And I didn't know how to explain that it had never felt like something she would understand. That when I had tried to share before, my stews, my stories, my time, it had been met with polite dismissals and phrases like, "No one eats like that anymore." Instead, I said, "It just happened. I didn't plan it." There was a pause. Then she said, "I'd like to come." I wasn't ready for that. But I said, Okay. She asked if Ruby could come too. I said yes. When I hung up, I stared at the wall for a long time. My stomach felt like it did when I hosted birthday parties years ago, anxious, unsure if anyone would be happy or if someone would leave early without saying goodbye. That Friday, I scrubbed the kitchen twice. I ironed napkins. I made 3 main dishes, not knowing if they'd eat anything or pick at the edges like before. I didn't want them to find fault. I didn't want them to find anything to roll their eyes at. But more than that, I didn't want them to come and feel nothing. They arrived a few minutes late. Susan wore a pressed blouse. Ruby had earbuds dangling around her neck. I greeted them both with a hug, trying not to overdo it. The table was already full when they walked in. 11 women, half of whom had already started talking about gardening and someone's broken fence. They looked around like strangers in my home. I introduced them quickly and motioned for 2 seats I'd saved near the end of the table. Susan gave a small nod. Ruby smiled politely, if a bit tight. Dinner began. I served from the kitchen, as usual, lasagna, green beans with toasted almonds, a rustic beet salad with goat cheese. Everyone helped themselves. Lila's son passed the bread basket. Joy made a joke about portion sizes. Diane started a story about her neighbor's cat. Susan barely touched her plate. Ruby tried a little of everything but kept glancing at her phone. I watched them both from across the table, wondering if they were comparing this moment to every old version of me they carried. Halfway through the meal, someone asked what the recipe was for the lasagna. I explained it wasn't written down, that it came from memory, layers passed from my mother's voice to my hands. That's how food used to be, Nora said. No exact measurements. Just what felt right. Ruby looked up. But how do you know it turns out the same every time? I smiled. I don't. But it's not supposed to. That got a few chuckles. Susan gave a quiet laugh too, but she looked tired. Not from the day, but from something deeper. Like she was trying to figure out how to belong here without undoing everything she'd ignored. After dessert, apple crumble with cinnamon and oat topping, most of the women moved to the backyard. Someone played music on a Bluetooth speaker. Sheila and Marlene lit a few citronella candles. I started stacking plates, automatically falling into cleanup mode. Susan appeared beside me with a dish towel. I'll help, she said. I didn't argue. For a few minutes, we worked in near silence. Finally, she asked, "Why didn't you invite me sooner?" I kept drying the plate in my hand. Because I didn't think you'd want to come. She nodded slowly. I didn't know you had all this in you. I didn't know what to say to that. It's not just the food, she added. It's something else. I see it. They feel safe here. I stopped and looked at her. They are. She leaned against the counter and sighed. I think I've missed a lot. You were busy, I said. It wasn't an excuse. Just a truth. I think I didn't know how to see you like this, she admitted. As someone with her own life. Not just someone who raised me. That one got me. I looked away, focused on the silverware. You're doing something important, Mom. I nodded, because I wasn't sure I could speak without choking on it. Ruby wandered in a little while later. She picked up a fork and started putting dishes in the sink. I didn't expect it to be like this, she said. What? She shrugged. Comfortable. You smiled ahead. That's the goal. Before they left, Susan asked if she could bring a friend next week. A woman from her book club whose husband had recently passed. I said yes. Later, after the house was quiet and the last plate was put away, I opened my mother's recipe book and slid in a new note. 12 seats tonight. 1 for my daughter. 1 for the girl who thought she'd outgrown my food. And then below it, sometimes they come back. Just hungry in a different way. The week after Susan and Ruby came, everything felt different. Not in a bad way, but like something had shifted. The supper club was no longer something secret. It had spilled into my family and into the world outside our circle of regulars. Susan called me twice that week. Not to ask about food, but to ask about people. She wanted to know who brought the raspberry jam, what book Diane had mentioned, whether Marlene needed help fixing the broken leg on her patio chair. And then she asked something else. Do you think Dad would have liked this? I wasn't sure how to answer. David had liked simple evenings. Good food. Quiet conversation. But this was something bigger. Something more alive. I think he'd like the way people linger, I said. He always said that was the best part of a dinner. She agreed. That Friday, she arrived early. Helped slice tomatoes. Asked to borrow my apron. She had invited 2 friends from her yoga class. One brought a chocolate tart. The other brought stories about her time in the Navy. We had 14 people at the table. I didn't recognize the sound of that many women laughing together in my backyard. It was louder than usual. Not chaotic, but full. Complete. That night, we ran out of chairs. I stood for a moment, unsure what to do. But before I could offer up a solution, Lila grabbed 2 cushions from the living room. Nora carried out a storage bench from the hallway. They didn't ask. They just filled the space. Later, I realized that was the whole point. They weren't waiting for permission anymore. They were showing up and creating their own seat at the table. Someone else brought a song. A woman named Teresa, who had only just started coming, stood after dessert and said she wanted to sing something her grandmother used to hum while shelling peas. At first it felt awkward. Everyone quieted. But then she began a slow, sweet tune with no words, just sound. It was soft and low, like a lullaby. A hush settled over the group. Even the children who had started tagging along with their mothers fell silent. I watched their faces, the older women who closed their eyes, the younger ones who blinked faster than usual. The music wasn't polished. It wasn't meant to impress. It simply belonged. When she finished, no one clapped. We just sat in it. Let it hang in the air like steam rising from fresh soup. That's when I realized what this had become. It wasn't a club. It wasn't a trend. It was a refuge. A reminder. A reason. We didn't gather because we missed the food. We gathered because we missed being seen. After the dishes were washed and the table cleared, Susan lingered while I put away the extra glassware. Ruby helped Nora pack up leftovers. Marlene offered to mend a torn curtain in the guest room. It had become a rhythm. No one left too early. No one needed an excuse to stay. Susan turned to me and said, "You've created something people depend on. Do you know that?" I shook my head. I didn't set out to create anything. She smiled. That might be why it works. The next morning, there were 2 notes in my mailbox. One handwritten, thanking me for the warmth and the bread. The other had no signature, just a simple message. I haven't felt safe in years. Last night I did. I placed it inside my recipe book, right between the pages for carrot soup and lemon cake. That afternoon, I walked to the market. I ran into a woman who recognized me. Not from church, not from the neighborhood, but from someone else's story. "You're the supper club lady," she said. "I heard about you from my sister-in-law." She said it saved her. I didn't know what to say. She asked if she could come sometime. I told her she'd be welcome. Like everyone else. No invitation needed. The following Friday, we hit 17. We didn't have enough matching plates, so people ate on mix-and-match porcelain from 3 different decades. Someone spilled soup. Someone brought wine that didn't quite pair with the roast. No one cared. Diane made a toast halfway through. To the ones who built us. And the ones who stayed anyway. Everyone raised their glass. Lila added, and to the ones who arrived late, but still found their place. It was the first time I realized how many stories were overlapping. How many timelines were touching. Grief and joy, motherhood and widowhood, retirement and reinvention. All in one backyard. Later, when the group had thinned out and only a few of us remained, Joy looked at me and said, "What if we made a cookbook?" someone asked. "No," she said. "A memory book. Of this. Of us." I laughed. "Who would read it?" She smiled. "Maybe no one. Maybe just us." And that sounded just fine to me. Before bed that night, I wrote down a new line inside my mother's recipe book. "The table is growing." And I think she would have liked that. It was late October by the time we passed 20 guests. The air had changed. It arrived slowly, the way fall always does in our part of the world. First in the way the sunlight slanted through the windows, Then in the sharpness of the air, when I stepped out to collect the mail. Leaves scattered across the patio, dry and curled at the edges. I didn't sweep them away. I liked the crunch underfoot. That Friday, I served roasted squash soup, rosemary bread, and pear crumble. Everything smelled like memory. Susan brought blankets. Diane brought tea in a thermos. Lila wore a beanie her son had knitted in school colors. We were all bundled in sweaters and scarves, still talking, still laughing, still lingering. But something was different that night. People arrived earlier. They stayed later. The conversations grew deeper. One woman shared that she'd been coming to the dinners for a month, and it was the only place she hadn't cried. Another said she'd finally told her adult daughter about a long-held regret she'd buried for years. They weren't just sharing meals anymore. They were sharing freedom, permission, truth. I didn't do much that night. I cooked, yes, and made sure the cider stayed warm, but I felt more like a witness than a host. I watched them settle in. I listened to stories unfolding across every corner of the yard. One woman was telling another about a trip she'd taken to Ireland in her 20s. Across the table, someone else was explaining how she'd finally started painting again after 30 years. No one asked for directions. No one waited to be introduced. It had become self-sustaining, like a garden that, once planted, begins to sprawl beyond its original fence. At one point, I sat on the edge of the bench and simply listened. The sound was layered, silverware on ceramic, soft voices, the occasional laugh. It reminded me of the way our house used to feel during the holidays. Not the noisy kind of chaos, but the warm, layered kind. Full but not overwhelming. Familiar. Midway through the evening, Marlene stood up and clinked her spoon on her mug. "Can I say something?" The group quieted. "I just want to thank whoever made the squash soup," she said. It reminded me of my sister. She used to make something like it every fall. Same spices, same color. I hadn't tasted anything like it since she passed. I raised my hand sheepishly. That was me. She nodded. It hit me in a good way. We all smiled. Later, Sheila brought out a notebook. It was plain, with a blue cover. She said she wanted to start collecting thoughts, anything people wanted to share. Recipes, memories, quotes. "We've got something worth holding on to," she said. Everyone passed it around. A few wrote quietly, while the rest chatted. I didn't read what they wrote. Not yet. I figured I'd look later. After dessert, someone suggested we light the fire pit. It hadn't been used in years. Michael had given it to David for Father's Day long ago, but it had sat in the corner ever since. Joy and Ruby got it going. They used old twigs from the garden bed and a stack of newspapers from under the sink. It took time, but eventually the flames caught. We circled around it like kids at a campout. Someone started singing again. Nora read a poem. Lila's son roasted a marshmallow, then gave it away to the quietest woman at the table without being asked. It was near 11 by the time people began to leave. As I walked back through the kitchen, I noticed Susan had already done half the dishes. Diane had wiped down the counter. Even the crumbs had been swept. I didn't ask them to. They just knew. They wanted to. I poured myself a mug of leftover cider and sat on the back step. The wind had picked up. The chairs were slightly askew. Candles had burned down to stubs. But it all felt just right. Susan joined me a few minutes later. "You okay?" she asked. I nodded. "I know this started as a reaction," she said. "But it's become something so much bigger than that." I looked at her. "It didn't start because I was angry," I said. "It started because I was hungry." She smiled. "For what?" "To be useful again. To feel like my life still had a table in it. And a seat." Susan didn't say anything right away. She just sat beside me. "Ruby asked if she could bring her friend next time," she said. "I told her she had to check with you." I nodded. "There's always room for one more." Before she went home, she handed me a slip of paper. "From the notebook," she said. "I copied it down because I thought you'd like it." I unfolded it after she left. In someone else's handwriting, it said, "The table healed me. Not all at once, but every Friday a little more." I tucked it into my mother's recipe book. And I knew, without question, that the supper club wasn't just feeding others. It was feeding me too. November came in like a whisper. The leaves fell faster. The air got colder. I started setting the table with thicker mugs and switching out the tablecloths for older quilts. The supper still happened every Friday no matter what. People still came. Some weeks we had 20. Some weeks we had 12. But no one ever showed up alone. Even if they walked in by themselves, they weren't alone for long. By now, the rhythm of the night didn't need direction. People arrived with covered dishes, bottles of cider, folding chairs from their garages. Some brought food. Others brought stories. A few just brought themselves. I started to notice how they handled each other. Marlene always made space for Diane's knees with a second pillow. Nora brought extra gloves and passed them around without asking. Lila made a habit of leaving notes for Ruby's son when he wasn't able to come, just little drawings or jokes. No one told her to. She just did it. And the new woman, her name was Bettina, who came after her brother's funeral, was offered the seat closest to the heater. Every single woman made space for her, without words. It wasn't just a supper club anymore. It was a shelter stitched together from instinct. The food was always good, but it wasn't perfect. One night the bread burned. Another week, someone brought a kale salad that no one touched. It didn't matter. The point wasn't the menu. The point was the table. Susan asked if we could add one more gathering before Thanksgiving. A potluck, she said. Just us. No rules. We held it the Wednesday before. Everyone brought something that reminded them of family. Joy brought a green bean casserole, the old-school kind with the canned soup. Ruby made a boxed mac and cheese and added a secret spice. Sheila made apple dumplings wrapped in crescent rolls. My cheat dessert, she called it. I roasted a turkey breast and made gravy the way my mother taught me. Nothing fancy. Just flour, broth, a little butter, and a lot of patience. The table stretched across the entire living room. We pushed the furniture aside, set up folding tables end to end, and covered them with mismatched linens and every candle we could find. There was no music, just conversation. At one point, Bettina stood and held up her glass. She was still relatively new, but her voice was steady. I haven't had a Thanksgiving since 2019, she said. Not a real one. Not one that felt like something. She paused. This feels like something. Nobody clapped. Nobody had to. Later, while clearing plates, Lila told me her son had started cooking with her at home. He wants to make your soup, she said. He calls it the magic one. I offered to write it down. No need, she said. He already knows it by heart. That stuck with me. The next day, I found myself standing at the counter with my mother's recipe book again. Not cooking, just looking. I flipped through the pages, touching the notes, rereading the familiar lines. Then I opened the blue notebook, the one we passed around the table. Inside were pages of handwriting, scribbles, stories, quotes, gratitude. One entry caught my eye. This table didn't save me, but it gave me the room to begin again. I read it twice, and then I started to cry. Not the sharp kind of crying that sneaks up on you, but the slow, steady kind. The kind that seeps out after being held in too long. I cried for the meals I had eaten alone, for the days I felt like I had nothing left to offer, for the years I believed my best contributions had already been made. I cried for every woman who had shown up hungry, for comfort, for peace, for company. And then I dried my face, pulled a pen from the drawer, and added something to the bottom of the page. If love can live in a bowl of soup, then I have never stopped loving. That Friday, we ate inside for the first time. It was too cold for the yard. The wind had picked up, and even the citronella candles wouldn't stay lit. So we moved indoors. We used every chair, every bench, every surface. The kitchen table. The hallway buffet. 2 kids sat on pillows at the coffee table and passed each other cornbread muffins with quiet giggles. It felt different, but it still worked, because the people were the same. Near the end of the night, Susan sat beside me. You know, she said, when we were kids, I never realized how much food cost. Money? I asked. No. Effort. Time. Thought. Heart. I gave her a tired smile. I don't think we thanked you enough, she said. It's not too late. She reached for my hand. Thank you. The candles burned low. The wine ran out. No one noticed. It was the kind of night where everything fades gently and everyone leaves full. The first snow came the following week. It wasn't much, just a light dusting, but it clung to the porch railing and softened the sounds outside. I stood at the kitchen window with my hands wrapped around a cup of tea and thought about how long it had been since I looked forward to winter. For years, the cold season meant quiet. David used to chop firewood while I made stews we'd eat in front of the TV. After he passed, the cold months felt heavier, like time stretched too long between holidays. The house echoed in a way I hadn't known it could. But now, the snow didn't feel like a warning. It felt like a blanket. That night, we had our first indoor-only supper with a full group. I moved the furniture again. Susan brought folding chairs from her garage. Lila set out place cards made from cinnamon sticks and twine. Nora arrived early with tea lights shaped like stars. Diane brought music on a tiny Bluetooth speaker and played songs from everyone's youth, soft, familiar tunes that felt like part of the walls. We had 22 that night. The house creaked with every movement, but it held. People ate on their laps, perched on stools and cushions. The food was simple: braised beef, roasted vegetables, a beet salad that didn't get as much attention as I'd hoped. Someone spilled wine, and 3 women rushed to blot it with napkins before it soaked the rug. I didn't worry. Midway through the evening, Ruby stood up. She had a notebook in her hand, the same blue one we passed around weeks ago. Her cheeks were flushed, and I could tell she was nervous. "Grandma," she said, looking at me, "can I read something?" I nodded. She opened the notebook and began. "It's not a recipe," she said, "but it's something I wrote after the first dinner we came to." The room quieted. Forks were set down. Conversations paused. Ruby's voice was steady. "I thought I was just coming to humor my mom. I thought I'd be bored. But then I watched the way people talk to each other here. Not small talk. Not social media stuff. Real things. I saw women laugh with their whole bodies. I saw someone cry, and no one looked away." She paused. I realized I'd never really seen that before. Not in one place. Not with so many women who weren't trying to be anything except exactly who they were. A few people sniffled. Ruby smiled and looked at me. "I didn't know you were still growing," she said. "But I see you now." That got me. I stood and hugged her, and someone started clapping, not the kind of applause meant to perform, but the kind that comes when something has landed exactly where it should. After the meal, I noticed something else. The women didn't leave right away. They lingered in 2s and 3s, curled on the couch, leaning against the counters, washing dishes in pairs. It was as if they were trying to store the warmth, carry it back to whatever places they'd come from. Joy pulled me aside before she left. "I've been thinking," she said. "What if we did a winter solstice dinner? Something symbolic. Something that marks what this has become." I asked what she meant. "A table for the longest night," she said. "To remind us that even when it's dark, we have each other." I liked that. The following day, I found an old flannel sheet and started cutting it into strips. I didn't know what for yet, but I liked the rhythm of it. The preparation. Susan stopped by with extra candles. Lila emailed a recipe she wanted to try together. Marlene dropped off a stack of handwritten notes from the notebook. People had started making copies, wanting to remember what had been shared. That Sunday, I sat with my mother's recipe book again. And for the first time, I added a new page. A blank one. At the top I wrote, "For the meals we haven't made yet." The week of the solstice arrived with more snow than we expected. It blanketed the yard, covered the old fire pit, and wrapped the bare trees like a quiet spell. I stood on the porch that Wednesday morning, holding my coffee, and thought about all the footsteps that had crossed this yard in the last few months. All the chairs dragged across the lawn. All the conversations that had bloomed like spring, even as the season slipped toward winter. Inside, the house smelled like cloves and oranges. We had planned a special menu. Not elaborate, just meaningful. Lila's son had asked to make soup with me, and together we chopped carrots, leeks, and celery in silence. His hands were still small, but his confidence had grown. I let him stir the pot and taste it first. "You always know when it's done," he said. The table stretched from one end of the house to the other now. We'd gathered every chair, every bench. Some guests brought pillows, others brought slow cookers full of stew or rice dishes from their childhoods. The food wasn't coordinated. It didn't need to be. That night, we didn't start with a meal. We started with a candle. Joy lit it in the center of the table. She said nothing. She just stood for a moment, held the flame, and looked at each of us as if to say, "Remember this." Then she set the candle down, and we all followed. Each person lit a tea light. Some said names out loud. Some just nodded. The room filled with glow. One woman whispered, "For the friend I lost last year." Another said, "For the version of me I'm still learning to welcome." When it came to me, I didn't say a name. I just said, "For the woman I almost stopped being." And then we ate. We passed platters and laughed between bites. We complimented and refilled and cleared without needing instruction. Ruby and her friend handled the desserts. Bettina made hot chocolate from scratch. The kids stayed up too late. No one minded. After dinner, Susan stood and pulled out a slip of paper. She unfolded it carefully and read from the blue notebook we'd all come to treasure. "This was written by someone who didn't sign their name," she said. "But I think it speaks for all of us." She began. "I walked in here thinking I had nothing to offer. I thought my silence was too heavy, my grief too strange. But I left with something I didn't know I could find again: peace." No one spoke for a moment. Then Diane raised her glass. "To peace, in all its forms." We echoed it softly. Later, after everyone had gone and the candles had burned low, I sat at the kitchen table and looked around the room. There were napkins still on the floor, forks left drying on the rack, a stray mitten under a chair. But more than anything, there was warmth. The kind you don't measure by temperature. The kind that lingers in the bones. Susan came in from the hallway, carrying the extra blankets we'd handed out earlier. She placed them gently on the couch and turned to me. She said, "I think this house has never been more alive." I smiled. "I think you're right. I wish Dad could see it." I nodded. "Me too." She sat beside me, and we said nothing for a while. Then she added, "You gave us more than food. You gave us a way back to each other." I looked at her. My daughter. My adult child, who once rolled her eyes at my pies and now passed out dinner rolls like gold. "I just kept the door open," I said. "You kept the stove on, too," she whispered. And that somehow meant everything. Before bed, I opened the recipe book and added something new. Not a recipe, just a note. The longest night didn't feel long at all. The house held the light. By the first week of January, the snow was knee-deep and the sky stayed gray most days. Some of the women had started carpooling. Others walked with thermoses in hand and hand-knit scarves wrapped twice around their necks. Despite the cold, no one stopped coming. If anything, our numbers grew. I'd long given up trying to count chairs. We sat where we could, couches, stairs, ottomans dragged in from the bedroom. It didn't matter. The table was wherever we gathered. That Friday, I made lentil soup with cumin and lemon. I didn't follow a recipe. I just trusted my hands. They seemed to remember what my brain didn't bother to hold anymore. Susan brought soft rolls from the bakery. Joy brought candles shaped like small birds. Ruby's friend made a playlist of gentle songs that made the room feel like a safe place to land. Halfway through the evening, someone new spoke up. Her name was Elisa. She had been coming for weeks, but mostly stayed quiet. That night, she asked if she could read a letter. She pulled out a folded piece of paper and looked at me. "I wrote this for the version of myself that almost gave up." We nodded. She read. "I came to the table with nothing in my hands. Not a dish, not a story. Just the hope that I wouldn't be turned away. I didn't know if I could still connect with people. I had spent too long hiding behind screens and polite smiles. But here, no one asked me to perform. They just asked if I was hungry." She paused to breathe. "I've never been fed so deeply. Not just by the food, but by the way people listened. By the way no one changed the subject when the truth got hard to hear. Her voice cracked then. She folded the letter and sat back down. No one clapped. We just let it settle. After dinner, Ruby helped me dry the dishes. Her sleeves were too long, and she kept pushing them up as she moved. "Did you think it would ever turn into this?" she asked. "No," I said. "Maybe two." She looked around the room, where people were curled up in corners, trading phone numbers, swapping recipes, laughing like they had nowhere else to be. "It feels like a story," she said. "Like the kind people will tell one day." I smiled. Maybe they will. Susan came in from the hallway, where she'd been packing leftovers into foil. "We should make a book," she said. "For real." "About the food?" I asked. "About everything." That word, everything, carried more than I could respond to in that moment. So I nodded. They left late that night. The wind had picked up, but no one seemed in a hurry. One by one, they hugged at the door. Even the shyest women now offered warmth without fear. After they were gone, I walked through the quiet house. The table was a mess. Crumbs. Empty mugs. Wrinkled napkins. But it felt like home. The next morning, I opened my mother's book. I found the page labeled Widow's Garden Supper, 1963. I traced the lines with my finger. At the bottom, I added a note. "It bloomed again, Mama. Your table bloomed again." Before supper, I used to think my time had passed, that the best parts of me were folded away with old tablecloths and recipe cards no one asked for anymore. But I see it now. What we offer, even when dismissed, doesn't disappear. It waits. For the right moment. For the right room. For the right table. And if that stirred something in you, if you've ever been quietly edged out of your own space, or made to feel like your home, your effort, or your legacy no longer matter, then you need to hear about the woman who didn't just stand her ground, she rebuilt it room by room. They tried to push her out of the house she built her life in. But instead of arguing, she made a decision behind closed doors. One that changed everything. It's not just a story about property. It's about power. About choice. About saying, "You don't get to decide who I am." So, if you're ready to hear what happened when one woman turned the tables without raising her voice, watch the next story. You'll feel seen.